Years ago when I first taught my comprehensive course on the stanzas on the vibration of consciousness, the Spanda Karikas. And one of the key features, as I shared briefly with patrons a few years ago, is this teaching of the so-called 5 acts of Shiva, or the 5 acts of consciousness, as I defined it at the time in my translation of the stanzas and their exuberant and comprehensive commentaries, particularly by the great Kashmir sage Kshamaraja. And when we talked about the 5 acts of Shiva, we're really expressing this interest in how the 5 acts, from a philosophical perspective, inform Tantric, the Tantric movement in general. In the ensuing 10 years of my research and scholarship, I've come to be quite aware of the fact that these are not just 5 acts that are meant to help us improve or empower our lives, right? To understand the cycles of time, to understand the cycles of breath, to move beyond the way in which our preoccupation with becoming something better, becoming something more, is tethered to and therefore dissipated by the cycles of time. We can't hold anything in a experience, a worldview and experience of constant change. And this is the 5 acts of Shiva, which I talk about in my Nataraj videos from way back when. Emergence, stasis, dissolution, concealment of the divine, and revelation. And what I knew at the time was, of course, Shiva does not really represent an anthropomorphic god. In the actual Tantric scriptures, the term Shiva refers to this vibration of sonic experience, the universal harmonic. And this is how it's described, for example, in the Mandukya Upanishad. So while it's interesting and fun and relevant in a secondary sense to refer to these stages from a philosophical healing perspective, right, by imagining the god Shiva, I knew all along, and this has been confirmed since, that again, no matter how wonderful this philosophy might be, if we take these 5 acts simply from a philosophical perspective, that wonderment is really born from scholars taking, again, a second-hand look at what this is about. Because in the texts themselves, we find that these 5 acts are deeply important, not as symbols, but as actual phases in Tantric yoga practice, particularly in the practice known as Ucchara, or the elevation of sound, the lost chakra seed mantra practice, which is at the core of the liberating practice or system of yoga in all of the tantras. So that we begin to see, as I noted 10 years ago in the beginning of my research on how the 5 acts apply to this yoga, we begin to see through looking at the e-texts or the manuscripts that have been transcribed through search systems like BB Edit here, we begin to see that these 5 acts are specifically tied to the sequence of pranayama, and how that sequence of inhalation, internal pause, or kumbhaka, exhalation, and then external pause correlates both to the nadis, and of course the acts themselves are here, right? And the acts of consciousness, but beyond that, to the actual practice of uttering these monosyllabic sounds that pierce the granthis and awaken the third eye. And so to know the actual yogic function and correlation of these 5 acts, right? Emergence with inhale, or creation with inhale, right? Creating new body cells, a new cellular structure with each inhalation. Pause, exhale, pause, again, ties to this universal harmonic practice known as Ucchara. So what I've been doing over the years is compiling passages that talk about these 5 acts, as I said before, that the 5 acts are not just philosophically symbolic, but they are symbolic of the phases of each moment in this yoga practice. In other words, when you see the word shrishti, when you see the word for emergence, sthiti, or samhara, samhati, and stasis, again, in these texts, described as if they're the 5 acts, panchakritya, of Shiva dancing, they're actually referencing what you should do next in the breath mantra practice. Let's take a look at what happens when we search the term in Sanskrit, 5 acts. This is my search system, which will go through about 3,000 texts. Now, well, actually in my Tantric folder, let's just search through the Tantras here, e-text, in which there's about 1,800 texts, and just see how many hits we get, right? So this is a search through all of them, which is looking for anywhere the term 5 actions, pancha, 5, kritya, are mentioned. And what we see is a plethora of passages that refer to these 5 acts in particular, and I'll pick one of them. Let's go down to one of the latest texts, which is really interesting, right? The Pranatoshini, which is only 175 years old. And what we see here is the 5 acts are tied to what's called the 6 limbs. And what this means is one projects, right, each one of the 5 acts to one of the 6 seed mantras of the chakras. And these are worked accordingly in the body by way of the so-called Ucchara practice. This is one of the passages that I've broken down, where we see here Matrika means the sounds that comprise each of the 5 or 6 rather seed mantras are correlated to the 5 acts, pancha kritva, right? And for example, stitir hridalina santa, right? Samhatis charanadikam. This says, in the moment of sthiti, which is the breath pause, as we see here in our chart, right? Sthiti, internal kumbhaka or external. Sthiti happens, hridadi, right? Nasanta, in the place of the heart center, meaning in kumbhaka, in the heart, internal kumbhaka after a full in-breath, right? And Nasanta means at the end of the nasal bridge. That means external pause is that moment where we're harmonizing the seed sound, or the dot in the om syllable, also the dot at the end of each of the chakra seed mantras, as it passes through this space between the third eye and the crown of the head as a moment in this Ucchara practice. We can take a look here at some of the images we'll be looking at. This needs to be blown up, but right, the idea is from this point to this point, we're talking about the stasis, the moment where you're no longer exhaling, but there's a pause as the sound is allowed to rise through the crown of the head. So we'll be looking at what I want to look at, and I have been looking at, I want to share with you, is some of the passages from 47 different texts that specifically correlate the phases of the 5 phases of consciousness to Panchakritya, to the Pancha mantras. The 6 is just the syllable, their sound hung, right? So the 5 seed mantras, each with a different vowel that pass through that body. Shriman Magendre Tadvapahu, that body, as taught in the Magendra Tantra, right? One's body, rather, the body of a person, right, is the target for the practice or engagement, upai yogi bihi, of engaging the 5 acts, panchakritya, of Shiva, which are what? The pancha bihi, mantrahi, the 5 seed sounds that define yoga practice in the Tantras. So, what I'd like to do is take a blast from the past and look at some of the old studies that we've done in prior courses on the 5 acts, and then launch a real study into how these 5 acts become a cryptic code to follow in order to bijam karanam, right? Tan netramiti uchite, to open that netra, the third eye, which is the cause or the producing power of the seed that grants, or the seed sound, seed syllable, bija mantra, that grants jnanataya, universal sarva jnanataya, universal cognition or universal awareness. How? Through that shakti, that power, atmika, that embodies the threefold powers of drik, which is awareness or knowledge, kriya, action, icha, volition, meaning to say that power that births the human being as an expression of the divine. And that's where the philosophy ends. And you could say the sounds begin.